And then in retirement, there can be an absence of milestones. There can be an absence of purpose, right? So we need a new mountain to climb. And maybe the mountain we're climbing is die with zero. Maybe it's have the most fun possible. Maybe it's bless the lives of the grandkids, whatever it is. But we need a new purpose.
So here, Daniel Crosby, Chief Behavioral Officer at Orion Advisory Services. Daniel, how are you?
Great to be here, Roger.
I appreciate you hanging out with me on this 10th anniversary month, which is sort of insane to think about. 10 years thinking about one subject is been one of the best things I've ever done, not just professionally, but personally, of focus. Today, I wanted to explore with you one of the threads that I found along the way that I've been pulling in trying to find frameworks to help people empower themselves. So we think of retirement crisis as, people not having enough for retirement, which is a huge crisis. That is the main crisis. It really is. But there's also another crisis, which is sort of feels uncomfortable to talk about, but it's a crisis of people that have been successful either through, a combination of effort and serendipity and luck and all of that, of accumulating enough wealth. And when you become a really good accumulator and you've done it for decades, it has, I would imagine, a self-fulfilling loop of affirmation and comfort, etc. And I've discovered a lot of these people have a hard time harvesting and using, in this case, their financial wealth for themselves, for their family, and for the world, and end up dying with too much money. So I wanted to, from a behavioral aspect, talk about how do we overcome frugality?
Overcoming frugality, I love it. So I'll kick us off with a little research that I did with my colleagues at Orion. So we interviewed hundreds of people. It was just over 400 couples, and this was couples, right? But some interesting stuff came out of it. And the question was, what do you argue about most when you argue about money? So when you're with your significant other and you two are having a disagreement, what is it that you're fighting about? The number one answer was whether money is best used to enjoy today or to secure tomorrow. So we found that people tended to be very bifurcated. They tended to be very decamped into either, the best use of money is nothing's promised, YOLO, like let's live it up today, let's seize the day, let's enjoy the moment, sort of in the one camp, right? And then the other camp was, let's be responsible, let's be prudent, we don't know what's on the horizon, so let's save, right? So what we found is this is the number one point of disagreement because these are the most deeply held values. And so the people that you're talking about are the people in that second camp whose primary financial script and whose primary financial value has been for 40 years or whatever to squirrel it away, accumulate, and then one day it's time to flip the switch and to do differently than you've done for 4 decades. It's not an easy thing to do, but I share that just to say that this is no small problem. My research would suggest that maybe it is the problem and the number one place where people tend to disagree.
And there's a lot of behavioral things that change when you leave full-time work, right? That can exacerbate that natural stewardship or accumulation, right? I lose my income, which feels that I always think of income. Yeah, I ask people, Daniel, when you earned your first dollar, what did you spend it on?
My first dollar ever in my life?
Yeah. Well, do you remember when you earned your first dollar from work?
I don't actually, but if my first one as a high school student, probably shoes or something.
And mine was probably baseball cards.
I found my 10-year-old journal yesterday. I posted about this online. It said, it was like this fill in the blank journal. And it said, what do you want to be when you grow up? And it was a millionaire with lots of baseball cards. That's what I wanted to be.
Well, the reason I ask that question is because usually when we earn our first dollar, it is the first time we have some agency over, I have this dollar and I have choice, other than parents giving us money. And when we retire, we lose that agency. We can't fight ourselves out of financial mistakes. And not only can we not do that, which when you don't have agency, you feel at risk, you're not accumulating anymore. So you don't get that natural satisfaction. And then we're supposed to suddenly actually spend it rather than save it like that. That's a lot to ask somebody. You were talking about in terms of the accumulation and the decumulation and the YOLO. That's like a natural tension that always will be there and never actually gets resolved. It's just finding that golden mean, I would think, somewhere in between.
Well, see, you're exactly right. I mean, if you think about that dichotomy and you say which one is the right answer, well, for the financial advisors I work with, I can tell you which one they prefer. But in terms of living a happy life, the golden mean is the answer. It's finding that synthesis of spending money to enjoy today and setting aside some amount of it to secure tomorrow. The other thing we'll talk about, if you look at any sort of model of human flourishing, they're going to have a lot of things in common, right? Like relationships are going to be part of any model of happiness and human flourishing, meaning working for something larger than yourself, advancement, being better today than you were yesterday, right? Engagement, doing deep work. These are sort of the hallmarks of human flourishing. Work ticks a lot of those boxes. And so when we leave work, we're left sometimes, if we haven't been thoughtful, we haven't been intentional, we're left with not a whole hell of a lot to hang on to. And so it can become easy to double down on what we do have or what we can control, which is the X's and O's in our bank account. And so, in the absence of all this other meaning and sort of structure, scaffolding falling away, it's easy to see where people double down on trying to control something like money.
I would say it's like a sporting dog that doesn't have a job or a working dog that doesn't have a job. They're going to use that energy in some other direction, sometimes healthy, sometimes not. It's interesting that you pointed out that our industry, from a financial planning perspective, has all been geared for accumulation for decades since I've been around, and that's been 30 years in the industry, and rightly so. And so it sets up that the default usually is, well, life is so uncertain. You might live to 100, inflation, bad markets, etc. Better to be safe. So that, the answers unspoken are work longer, save more, spend less when you do spend, which is sort of sucky choices.
Well, and incentives drive behavior. And I mean, I love the planning advice industry. That's where I do all my work. But it has to be said that most planners, most advisors get paid on the size of the assets they manage. So there's a stronger push for accumulation than sort of thoughtful decumulation, because that's how we get paid. Like, we get paid on more money in the bank. So it's not surprising perhaps that there's more thought and more direction that goes into that piece of that piece of the puzzle.
And the bulk of the clientele has been in accumulation mode. So I would say most advisors, even with that conflict, manage it well. But everybody's been accumulating. What I have found, and I'm curious, have you read the book Die with Zero by Bill Perkins?
No. So I talked to Tim Maurer about it at some length. He kind of broke it down for me, but I have not read it yet. It's on my nightstand.
I just finished it. I've been with people that suggested that I read it. And I don't agree with everything he says, but a couple of the concepts I have seen in clients and in the podcast over the 10 years is when you're 60, let's use that as an example, you assume you live to 90. So you got a 30-year time period. I think people are very aware that the first 10 years or 5 years are when they're going to be healthiest and most active. At least that's how they feel. So there's this pressure to live. But there's also this worry of being destitute when you're 90, right? Or 85. And there's another tension that we're talking about. And absent having some confidence that you're going to be okay, the people with the most options generally are going to just defer. If they don't know it's okay to spend money this year, they're just naturally defer. So how does someone get confidence when there's so much uncertainty that you can never know the answer?
Yes. So I think, I'll draw on one of the models that I teach to our advisors, and I think it works for the listeners here as well. So it goes empathize, normalize, purpose proof process. So we'll break all those down, right? So, the empathize and the normalize, right? So an advisor who's listening to his or her client break down this, like, hey, I'm having a hard time flip the switch. We can empathize with how difficult that is because, yeah, like I'm asking to do something that's diametrically opposed to what I've spent the last 4 decades asking you to do. And we can normalize that for them. Like, yeah, it's you're not weird for having these feelings. Like this is a very human, a very normal thing that many people go through, right? So those are sort of the first steps. Now, the purpose, this is one place I think we fall down. Like, you remember the old commercials about what's your number and like people dragging around their number, right? For so many people, there is this mountain to climb with respect to retirement. That's the purpose, to accumulate X, to cross whatever finish line, to work until whatever age, to secure whatever pension. And then we get there. And then in retirement, there can be an absence of milestones. There can be an absence of purpose, right? So we need a new mountain to climb. And maybe the mountain we're climbing is die with zero. Maybe it's have the most fun possible. Maybe it's bless the lives of the grandkids, whatever it is. But we need a new purpose. Stephen Covey talked about the only way to say yes in spite of, to say no to your fear was to have a bigger yes burning inside of you. And I don't know that we always have that in retirement. So, okay, the work mountain has been successfully summited. Now what? And I don't know that we always do a great job of that. So you need that purpose, right? Next, you need the proof, right? This is the dollars and cents. This is the financial planning. BlackRock found that among people who had been in retirement for 20 years, better than 80% of them were within striking distance of where they started. And many of them, a small 20-ish percent of them had more than they started with, right? So we know that a great deal of people tend to do well in retirement. They tend to keep their spending in check, right? And they need those numbers. They need that assurance. And then finally, they need a process, right? They can't just be turned loose. It feels too chaotic. We need some models. We need some numbers. We need a budget. So once we've been listened to, right? Like take that out. We've been listened to. We've been understood. We need that purpose. We need that new mountain to climb, right? We need the proof. We need to understand the math around the retirement. And we need a process by which it's realized. And I think that once we get those things, then we're on our way. In the absence of those things, I think we don't have the rocket fuel to sort of pursue it the way we should, and we don't have the stability or the plan that gets us there.
I think the idea of having proof is a difficult one when it comes to retirement planning. I just had Rick Nason on, a professor who talks about the difference between a complicated problem and a complex problem. And in my opinion or observation, the planning profession tends to approach it as a complicated problem that can be solved. We just got to do the numbers.
Yeah.
And I would argue that it's not a complicated problem. It's a complex problem that is not solvable for a variety of reasons. So it has to be managed. And so that proof is difficult because you can't prove that you will be okay, right? If I go and give $100,000 to a charity to my children at age 61, it's a bet that I won't need that $100,000 when I'm 80. And at some point, it's a faith with a structure of giving you confidence, but it's a leap of faith in a way. And that's the hard part, I think.
It's definitely hard. This is not physics, right? And I mean, we could die on the first day of retirement, or we could die on the 40th year of retirement. And so I think there's a place for being conservative in those judgments for sure, right? And I think you're never going to really die with zero, probably, right? I think you're never going to be able to spend that last dollar on that last day of life. But I do think that we can get in the ballpark. We know that the map is not the territory, right? When it comes to financial planning, there's acts of God, there's the human element that makes it more indeterminate than we would like. But I do think you can get in the ballpark close enough that you can make meaningful life choices around it.
The reason I had brought up that book, Daniel, is one of the exercises towards the end mirrored something I did with a client recently where we were having a discussion about they wanted to sell some rental properties. And they wanted to take 4 years to do it because they're very methodical project managers. And I asked them, well, how long are you going to live? And they said, 20 years. I'm like, so you want to take 20% of your life to sell these properties and manage this project. And it's 20% of their life that is the front end when they're the youngest and healthiest. And some of it's having some of that perspective. And when I thought one of the exercises in Bill Perkins' book, which I just finished literally yesterday, was to write out the things that you want to do in life. Yeah, I want to hike, I want to mountain bike, I want to go to these places, and then organize them by timeline, because certain things need to be front loaded just from an ability perspective as we age. And I thought that was a good exercise to maybe help people see that holding on to the money or thinking that you're going to be able to do certain things later on is not the case, because you're getting older. And it gets even more front and center when you're 60 or 70.
Well, I mean, there's some behavioral science to creating these timelines. It sparks a sense of urgency in us, right? I see my parents, I call it twice a year, right? And my parents, if they live to an average age, will be, live another 15 years. So like I've got, each visit with my parents is 3% of my total visits I'll ever have with my parents. Like, oh my gosh, right? Thinking about it in those terms gives us a renewed sense of urgency. I have a daughter who's a freshman in high school, and we think about our summers with her, and it's like every summer is 25% of our remaining summers with her. So how are we going to maximize those things? I think what you did with your client is really brilliant, to think about these things and to put them on a timeline, which again is not perfect, right? Like my parents could die tomorrow, or they could die when they're 100, but still running the numbers and giving it some urgency and doing some tentative math around it, I think gives us a kick that we need sometimes.
Yeah, that change of perspective really with your children. I look back and I never had that perspective. I look back with my kids now in their 20s, like, wow. There was a last time that I read to my kids. There was a last time I had summer with them, which leads to regret. And that's part of the reason I think of doing this, because if we don't have a model to give ourselves confidence, what will end up happening, and I have seen this, is like you said with the research, is you're going to end up having more money than you expected when you were in your 80s or 90s. And you're going to look back and say, well, what could I have done? And that will lead to like Bronnie Ware's regrets of, the dying that she pointed out.
Well, we're always looking for these behavioral hacks, and regret aversion. I mean, people are wired to avoid regret in a pretty significant way, right? And so, thinking about or working with your advisor to talk about, what would I regret is a powerful catalyst for living a fuller, richer life, and maybe spending some of that money, because we're more we're less excited about good thing. We're less excited about getting something good than we are upset about missing out, right?
Yeah,
we're 2.5 times more upset about missing out than we are getting something good. And so rather than framing it in terms of, hey, what could I do? It's actually weirdly powerful to say, what might I miss out on if I don't begin to spend some of this money?
Well, let's think of a couple basic things someone could do to overcome frugality if they're naturally good accumulators. Usually the first one I go to is just make a 1-year decision. Don't make big decisions. Just experiment on one extra trip a year
Yeah.
rather than planning out, because that's just an experiment. One time probably isn't going to blow anything up.
Yeah. I love it. That's great.
What would be something else in your mind that
I'm going to go with make those list of regrets as one, like really formalize that list of regrets. The Clonces, too, a father-son duo at behavioral researchers, they've done some research around vividness actually helps people to make better decisions in retirement, right? So you say, okay, I want to retire, like I want to go live in a cabin in the woods. Like, okay, well, which woods, right? Like, okay, the woods of Vermont. Like, well, describe the mountaintop to me. Like, what will it smell like? What will the maple syrup taste like on the pancakes on Saturday? Like, really getting in that process of visualizing. I wrote about this in my new book I have coming out, that Michael Phelps, this is one of the things that he did. When you see him prepping for the Olympics, all those gold medals he won, he's sitting there with his eyes closed, kind of visualizing going through all of it. Deep visualization, talking with your partner, your advisor, whoever, about the nitty gritty, down to the very specific sensory details of what you want to do, can be a powerful force for good.
I can think of an example of that, Daniel, and that is we have a number of clients that use their money to bring all of the family together on big vacations. And I have one client who has like 18 grandchildren, but they pay for everybody. They rent the house or houses and they pay for everybody. And that's a way of people tend to die with experiences, not money. As far as, the people that remember you, and that vividness of all of the people in the house and the things that are going to be done, the kind of conversations you're going to have with those grandkids. Essentially what you're arguing is make that as vivid as possible, because then it becomes real and then you can go create it. And that will help give you permission to spend the money on something that actually I think is a great idea.
Yeah, that's a really great example right there. This goes back that you triggered something in me, for so long, like for so many people, and I put myself in this camp. I'm a very aggressive saver, right? And that's a point of pride for me. And I feel like it says good things about me. I don't know if it actually does, but I get psychic utility out of that, right? Like,
that's a great point.
Yeah, like I'm hardworking, I'm prudent, I'm thrifty, I'm taking care of my family. Okay, when I get to the top of the mountain, what does prudence and taking care of my family look like now? Because it no longer looks like this other thing. So you can take that same value, in retirement, being prudent and thrifty and taking good care of your family might mean sending your 18 grandkids on a trip to Aspen, right? So you can spend time with them. That's what it looks like to be a good family man, right? Whereas in my mid 40s with 3 young children, it looks like saving for their college. So helping, taking those core values and reframing them, it's a bit like a soldier, right? It's a bit like a soldier who goes to war and learns that every time you hear a loud noise, you hit the deck. Then they come back home to Topeka and a car backfires and they hit the deck. Like, well, that's no longer appropriate, right? Like you're in Kansas now, you're safe, you're good. And so, you learned a behavior that you're just misapplying in context. In light of your new context, how can you still be the person who you are and thread those values through, but maybe it requires a new behavior?
And this is something that is a journey, not a aha moment, I'm different. It's a journey, right?
Yeah. Well, you're not going to undo 40 years of programming in 4 minutes. That's why I think your admonition to just experiment, right? Like small commitments. 1 year, take that extra vacation, do the family trip. How'd it go? What did you think? I think is a great one. We know that a behavior in motion tends to stay in motion, right? This is one of these, they call it foot in the door or commitment theory. And in psychology, is just experiment with a behavior, see how it goes. We think you're going to like it. Spending money is quite nice. We think you're going to like it, and then you'll be back for more.
The other place I focus on is to decrease friction. I have had deep discussions with somebody about flying business class if they're going overseas. It seems like such an extravagant behavior, but it totally changes the experience arriving fresh when you get to wherever your destination is. But it feels so extravagant. Or even mowing the yard, right? To send that off. In the club, in the Rock Retirement Club, I used to have office hours. So I've had hundreds of conversations with people that accumulated well. And one of the threads that I pulled in that, Daniel, is that they came into the meeting. Usually they would present with some question about Roth conversions or some tax thing. But most of the time underneath, what I observed anyway, was that they knew what they wanted to do, but they were trying to get permission to do it, which really was surprising to me. And I would argue that in retirement, this, for the people that, the people that have the ability and have the wealth, this is not just a big opportunity to minimize regret and have an impact on your family. This is a huge untapped resource not for the world. And because what will end up happening is people will just die with too much money. They'll have regret. The family won't have the memories, and the world won't have whatever gifts they might have been able to give along the way. I think as an advisor, we're perfectly positioned to help facilitate that and help give themselves permission.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And another thing, I see that sometimes people have a too tight conflation of their personal worth with their net worth. They think that, the number they have in the bank is reflective of a life well lived, and industry and thrift and commerce and all these positive things. But I think we have to help them think about, what does a life well lived in retirement look like? One of the things that I've researched again for this new book, there is a term for shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations in every culture around the world. Right? This idea that, one generation, sort of gets it started, the second generation builds on it, and the third generation squanders it, tends to be sort of a common human truism. And so if we're not thoughtful about the way that we distribute our wealth, it's likely that someone else down the line will be thoughtless about it. And I think we're not always setting people up the way that we think we are.
Now, remind me of the name of your book coming out this fall.
So the book out this fall is called The Soul of Wealth.
The Soul of Wealth. We'll have a link to it in 6 Shot Saturday. Daniel, thanks for hanging out with me to noodle on overcoming frugality.
You're a great dude, Roger. Here's to another 10 years.